Across his 4 decades of work, game creator and director Hideo Kojima has been known for subverting expectations. Death Stranding 2 on the beach is many things, but most of all, it is a giant leap forward from its 2019 predecessor. In this video essay/review, we'll do our best to avoid spoilers while remaining relatively thorough in discussing why, ultimately, I call On the Beach one of the most next-gen feeling games I've played in decades, as well as one of Hideo Kojima's greatest professional achievements. That being said, like all Kojima titles, Death Stranding 2 is not for everyone, and as we'll see, it will probably stay controversial for years to come. One, basic gameplay. As in the original Death Stranding, you play as the porter Sam Bridges, who in turn is played by Norman Reedus, on a mission to reconnect the continents, both inside and out, following the titular catastrophe that basically ended the world, the Death Stranding. But this time around, we're reconnecting countries like Mexico and Australia, regions suffering from particularly harsh climate change and societal collapse, and sporting, as a result, particularly wild environments. At first glance, the fundamentals haven't changed much in Death Stranding 2. The core gameplay loop still consists of getting cargo where it needs to go, and building relationships with the locals to unlock more gear. It's still focused on dynamic traversal and making you feel the awesome weight of every step as you navigate the brutal landscape, the pockets of troublemakers, the rainstorms, and the BT beached things, which are monsters from beyond the grave, the mountains, rivers, and valleys. But as we'll see, On the Beach is brutal in every possible sense of the word, in ways that the first game really can't compare with. In what I can only call this spiritual successor to the Metal Gear Solid series that also plays like the deranged yet addictive love child of Cyberpunk 2077 and The Last of Us 2, only those who can withstand the extremes that Death Stranding 2 has in store will ever enjoy it completely. But as I hope to also explain, even if you don't appreciate how brutally Death Stranding 2 tries to gouge out your heart and yeet it into oblivion, there's a lot to love about virtually everything that's around the main story, so long as the main story doesn't completely alienate you with its terrible, yet savagely beautiful, in a very dark way, betrayal of almost everything the first game worked so hard to set up. And all of these normally negative words like terrible and betrayal, because we're talking about Hideo Kojima, of course I mean in a good way. A good but controversial way that I can't really talk about directly until I do my inevitable super spoilery story analysis video. But first, let's talk combat. Combat in Death Stranding 2, alongside of course stealth, has been completely reworked and Metal Gearified. This series has finally fully become a glorious sandbox that lives up to the likes of, say, Metal Gear Solid 5. In many ways, On the Beach looks, feels, and plays like a Phantom Pain spiritual successor, and I am still recovering from the awesomeness of this realization. Here's just a selection of moments and mechanics in Death Stranding 2 that speak to the MGS ancestry better than any words could convey. But the other huge influence beyond MGS and the aforementioned Last of Us here is clearly Cyberpunk 2077. Under CD Projekt Red's influence, Death Stranding has gained some color, some intensity, some violence, dare I say, some balls. I recognize many ideas in Death Stranding 2 that originated with Cyberpunk 2077 and are sort of perfected here, if you ask me. The enemy AI, for instance, is reactive and adapts on the fly for once. And again, in our engagements with them, there is that Cyberpunk and Last of Us influenced brutality, even inhumanity. Barreling up and down the sand dunes of Mexico and Australia, Sam, no less than Cyberpunk's protagonist V, is an extremophile, trying to make it in the age of the extremophile, the age wherein the human being and civilization itself are both on the verge of self-destruction, of extinction. The obvious comparison to make here is perhaps to the anime Fist of the North Star, or of course George Miller's iconic Mad Max. But combat and stealth, however deep and engaging in Death Stranding 2, are only some of what, as Sam, that you'll be doing for your time playing the game. More than fighting, shooting, or sneaking, there is traversal. Death Stranding 2 has refined the first game's systems up, down, and center, with a surprising focus on fun and playability. I feel like if you have a bingo card for Futurison videos, one of the things that I almost always say is, we could do a whole video about X. Well, we could do a whole video about all the systems, all that ape-ass stuff I mentioned, and all the different ways that Death Stranding 2 sort of changes depending on how you play it and gives you different abilities and has all this strategic depth and like almost role-playing elements that the first one did not have. And again, a lot of that comes from the cyberpunk influence. There's just a surprising focus on fun and playability, despite the rather rare but very pronounced brutality in the main story. The game now feels like a proper voyage to faraway lands, where you still have to be mindful of bumps and crashes and falls, but a bit less so than in the original. I'd say there's less minor nickel and dime style damage in On the Beach, but more damage from direct high-speed collisions, which makes the key moments of decision making while navigating really matter. But far more than the first Death Stranding, in Death Stranding 2 you can really get into a delivery groove as you blast your music and pick up cargo and in some vehicles without even having to get out. It's just so fun to play this game, especially when you compare it to the first game, which by comparison can seem kind of drab and boring. There are far too many quality of life upgrades and new mechanics and job types to list here. But suffice to say that in On the Beach, unlike in the first Death Stranding, you're very unlikely to ever feel bored or spaced out or like this world is ever lifeless or empty in a bad way. But that only leaves the last section of this review before we close, where we dance around the story without spoiling anything. Good grief. So Death Stranding 2 is super dark and brutal in one very key respect that I won't spoil but will, without comment, compare to The Last of Us 2, Final Fantasy VII, and Metal Gear Solid 5 Ground Zeroes. That's all I'm willing to divulge at this time, not only because I need time to process the game and its heavy sense of loss, but also because all of you need time to experience it for yourself without spoilers. So let's just wrap up, shall we? Death Stranding 2, as I began, is many things. It's an open-world sandbox, Strand-type game that's about 10 times more immediately and consistently fun and MGS-y than I personally ever expected it to be. It's a game that tries to balance its own likability by subverting itself with a very painful twist and an overall more brutal game design. How well all that lands will really depend on you. But controversial main story aside, Death Stranding 2 is genuinely one of Kojima's all-time best games. It's a real triumph of the PS5, HDR, Ultra 4K era. It not only looks and sounds like God, it plays like a more sci-fi, open-world, delivery-oriented, sandboxy Metal Gear Solid. Do I really need to say any more? Until next time, boss.